My name is Cora Bradford, and I'm 33 years old. For 5 years, I didn't speak to my parents. Then I made the mistake of bringing my husband home. It was my grandmother's birthday, so I went back to the town I grew up in. At the family table, my father asked my husband what he did for a living. Daniel said he taught high school history. My father laughed, right there in front of everyone. A teacher? You just babysit kids for pennies. The whole table went silent. My husband didn't argue. He just nodded, quiet, and reached for his water like nothing had happened. But I knew that quiet, and I want you to remember it. Because my husband didn't say a word that night. 2 days later, he brought something to family dinner that made my father go completely silent. And what walked through that door I will never forget for the rest of my life. Welcome back to Hidden Family Revenge, the channel where quiet people finally get the last word, and every hidden truth comes home. If a story has ever moved you, you already belong here. Before we begin, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss how this one ends. Because it ended in a way even I didn't see coming. Let me tell you about my husband first. Daniel and I live in a small house on the west side of Cedar Hollow. It has a porch that leans, a kitchen that's always warm, and a stack of essays on the table that never seems to shrink. I'm an emergency room nurse at the county hospital. I work nights mostly. Daniel teaches history at the high school, and he's done it for 15 years. Most evenings he grades papers until midnight. His phone buzzes at all hours. It's never spam. It's kids. Former students, current ones who graduated a decade ago. They text him when they get into college. They text him when they don't. One boy texts every year on the day his father died, just to say thank you for staying late that winter. Daniel answers all of them. He never mentions it. That's who he is. I've watched him talk a panicking 16-year-old off a ledge over the phone at 2 in the morning, then get up at 6 to teach the Civil War with a coffee he forgot to drink. He is the calmest man I have ever known. It takes an extraordinary amount to rattle him. In 4 years of marriage, I'd seen it happen exactly twice. My father did it in a single sentence, over pot roast, in front of my whole family. And the thing that scared me wasn't the sentence. It was how easily Daniel let it slide off him, like he'd been called worse, and survived. He had. I just didn't understand yet how much of his life he had spent being underestimated. Or how many people were about to remind my father of that. I didn't always know men like Daniel existed. In my father's house, a person's worth was a number. Raymond Aldrich grew up poor, and he never forgave the world for it. He built a construction company from one truck and a bad back. By the time I was in high school, he had money, a big house, and a wall of framed awards he polished himself. He measured everyone by what they'd earn. When I told him at 19 that I wanted to be a nurse, he didn't ask if I'd be happy. He asked what a nurse made a year. Then he made a face I still remember. "So you want to spend your life wiping strangers?" he said. He wasn't joking. My mother, Sharon, agreed with whatever he said, the way she always did. I paid my own way through nursing school. Night classes, double shifts, a beater car that died twice. My father called it stubbornness. I called it the only clean thing I owned. For a long time, I still wanted him to be proud of me. That's the part I'm not proud of. I kept showing up to Sunday dinners, kept swallowing the comments, kept hoping the year would come when he finally said, "Good job, kid." It never came. And then, 5 years ago, something happened at a party in that same dining room that made me stop hoping altogether. I packed my things and I stopped answering his calls. I'll tell you what happened, but not yet. First, you need to understand why, after 5 whole years of silence, I ever agreed to walk back through that door at all. The reason was my grandmother. Margaret Aldrich is my father's mother, and she is 82 years old. She is nothing like her son. Margaret is sharp, funny, and allergic to showing off. She wore the same coat for 20 years and gave the difference to the church. In the 5 years I stayed away, she was the only one who never let go. She sent a card every month. Just a line or two in her shaky hand. "Thinking of you. The garden misses you. I'm still here. I kept everyone in a drawer by my bed. Then, in October, she called instead of writing. Her voice was thinner than I remembered. Cora, honey, I'm turning 82, she said. I'd like to see you before I don't get the chance. And I'd very much like to meet the man who married my granddaughter. I stood in my kitchen and couldn't speak. She waited, patient as ever. Your father will behave, she said, which we both knew was a hope, not a fact. Then she said something strange. There are things about this family you don't know yet, sweetheart. Come home, and I'll tell you some of them. I asked what she meant. She just laughed, soft and tired. Bring your husband. He'll understand better than you think. I didn't know what to make of that. I only knew she was 82, and I had already missed 5 of her birthdays, and I would not forgive myself if I missed the last one that mattered. So I said yes. I hung up the phone, and I went to find Daniel to tell him we were going back to the place I swore I'd never return to. Daniel didn't hesitate. That's the thing about him. I told him everything about my father over dinner, bracing for him to talk me out of it. He just listened, the way he listens to a kid who's finally telling the truth. Then he said, "Let's give your grandmother her birthday." I wasn't naive about what we were walking into. I know my father. So I planned. I booked us a room at the inn on Route 9, in my own name, paid in advance. I told Daniel the exit strategy out loud so it would feel real. If it turns ugly, we leave, I said. We don't argue. We don't perform. We just go. He nodded and repeated it back to me, which is a thing he does when he wants you to know he heard you. If it turns ugly, we leave. I packed like a woman going into weather. Flat shoes in case we walked out, a charged phone, cash. I even warned him about the wall of awards, and Gerald Voss, and the way my mother's compliments have hooks in them. Daniel took it all in and asked only one question. Does your father know what I do? I said no. It hadn't come up in 5 years of not talking. He nodded slowly, like he was filing it away. Then let him ask, he said. I didn't understand the weight behind that yet. I thought he was just being polite. I thought the worst thing that could happen was a cold dinner and an early night. I had no idea my father was about to hand my husband the exact question that would take our whole family apart and put it back together completely wrong for him. The Aldrich estate sits on the east side of town, behind a gate my father installed just to have a gate. The birthday dinner was in the big dining room, the one with the awards. There were maybe 20 of us. Aunts, cousins, my mother floating around in pearls, and Gerald Voss, my father's oldest business partner, seated like family. Margaret sat at the far end, small and bright-eyed, watching everything. Daniel shook every hand and remembered every name. For a while, it was almost fine. Then my father tapped his glass and turned his attention to the new man at his table. So, Daniel, he said, loud enough for the room, Cora never tells us anything. What is it you do for a living? The table quieted the way tables do when the host wants an answer. Daniel set down his fork. I teach high school history, he said. 15 years now. My father blinked. Then he smiled, and I knew that smile, and my stomach dropped. A teacher. He said it like a punchline. He looked around the table, gathering his audience. A teacher. You just babysit kids for pennies. Someone laughed, then stopped. My mother examined her napkin. Gerald Voss studied his wine. The whole table went silent, the good silver suddenly very loud against the plates. I felt my face go hot. I opened my mouth. And Daniel, under the table, put his hand on my knee. Not to stop me, to steady me. He looked at my father and he just nodded, once, calm as a Sunday. That's one way to put it, he said. That was all. He reached for his water and took a slow sip. My father waited for a fight and didn't get one, and that made him louder, not quieter. But I wasn't watching my father anymore. I was watching my grandmother. Margaret had gone very still at the end of the table. Her eyes had darkened and her jaw had set, and she was looking at her son like she was seeing something she'd hoped was finally gone. My father recovered the room the way he always does, by talking about himself. He walked Daniel over to the wall of awards like a tour guide. Contractor of the Year, twice. A photo with the mayor. A plaque from the country club. He pointed at each one and told the story behind it, the number attached to it. Daniel listened politely and asked good questions, which only made my father talk more. Then my father got to his favorite. "And this one," he said, tapping a framed certificate, "is my donation to the Cedar Hollow Scholarship Fund. Biggest gift they got that year. Even I give back, you know." He said it like giving was a strange hobby he'd tried once. I knew about that fund. Everyone in town did. For 10 years, some anonymous donor had been quietly paying tuition for local kids who couldn't afford it. Nobody knew who. It was the town's favorite mystery, whispered about at the diner and the barber shop. My father loved being near it. He'd donated once, made sure everyone heard, and let people wonder if maybe he was the secret angel. He wasn't, but he liked the doubt. My mother drifted over and put her oar in, too. "Cora's a nurse," she told Daniel in the voice she uses for bad weather. "We keep hoping she'll do something with herself." Daniel smiled at her, unbothered. "She saves lives at 2 a.m, he said. "I'd call that something." My mother didn't have an answer for that, so she laughed and changed the subject. I looked at Daniel, this calm man surrounded by my father's trophies, and I had the strangest feeling, like the wall was bragging to the wrong person, like somewhere in this town there was a bigger story my father had never bothered to learn. We left before dessert. I kissed my grandmother goodbye and promised to come back. In the car, on the 15-minute drive to the inn on Route 9, I finally let go. "I'm so sorry," I said. My hands were shaking on the wheel. "I should never have brought you into that. He had no right." Daniel was quiet for a moment, watching the dark road. "Cora," he said, "I've been called worse by 14-year-olds before lunch. It's fine." I laughed, because he wanted me to, but it didn't reach my chest. "It's not fine," I said. "Babysitting kids for pennies, in front of everyone. He doesn't even know you." "No," Daniel agreed. "He doesn't." Something in the way he said it made me glance over. He wasn't hurt. He wasn't even angry. He looked like a man who had decided something and wasn't ready to say it yet. "You could have told him," I said, "about the award, the state thing, any of it. You just sat there." He turned to me, and in the passing streetlights his face was gentle. "Telling him wouldn't have changed his mind," he said. "Men like your father don't believe words. They believe evidence." I didn't know what evidence he meant. I only knew that something had shifted in the seat beside me. My whole life I had begged my father to see me. That night, watching my husband stay so completely calm while my father tried to shrink him, I felt the begging finally burn out of me. I was done waiting for Raymond Aldrich to become a better man. That was the night I stopped waiting for my father to change. And I started planning what I would do instead. I need to tell you now what happened 5 years ago. It was in that same dining room. I was 28, still trying, still showing up. My father threw a dinner and told me it was just family. It wasn't. He'd invited Gerald Voss and Gerald's son, Brett, and he'd arranged the whole evening like a merger. Brett was going to take over his father's firm. My father wanted Aldrich blood married into it. He'd decided all of this without asking me. Halfway through the meal, he stood and made a toast to the future of both our families, and put his hand on my shoulder like I was a signed contract. I was seeing someone else at the time, quietly. I was also 2 semesters from my nursing license. I stood up and said gently that I wasn't interested, that I had my own plans. My father's face changed in front of everyone. "Your own plans," he said. "Bedpans and a boy with no name. I raised you better than this." He said it in front of Gerald, in front of Brett, in front of my silent mother. He told the table I was throwing my life in the trash. I stood there, 28 years old, being auctioned and insulted in the same breath. So I put down my napkin. I said, "Then I'll take my life somewhere you don't have to watch." And I left. I didn't slam anything. I just stopped calling, stopped visiting, stopped explaining. 5 years of silence, all of it starting at that table. Which is why walking back into that same room, watching him do the exact same thing to the man I did marry, lit something in me that 5 years of quiet had only banked, not put out. The next morning, we got breakfast at the diner on Main Street. I hadn't eaten there since I was a girl. We slid into a booth, and the waitress came over with the coffee pot. And then she stopped dead. "Mr. Bradford?" she said. Daniel looked up. "It's me, Wanda. My boy is Cody." Her face crumpled and lit up at the same time. "You kept him in school, junior year, when his dad went to prison. You drove him yourself when he had no ride." She had to set the pot down. "He's at the community college now. First one in our family." She squeezed Daniel's shoulder and hurried off to the kitchen so we wouldn't see her cry. Daniel just said, "Cody's a good kid," and buttered his toast. It kept happening. A man at the register nodded and said, "Morning, Mr. B." A woman by the door mouthed thank you and pointed at a teenage girl beside her. On the sidewalk, a UPS driver rolled down his window to shout that his daughter got the scholarship. Daniel waved and remembered every single name. I sat there and watched a whole town greet my husband like he mattered. In my father's town, everyone seemed to know Daniel. Everyone except my father. I thought about that wall of awards, all those numbers in frames. And then I thought about Wanda setting down her coffee pot to keep from crying. And something started to take shape in my mind. If my father only believed in evidence, if numbers and status were the only language he spoke, then maybe it was time somebody showed him the real ledger. Not with a speech. With people. That afternoon, my mother called. I almost didn't pick up. "Your father feels terrible," she said, which was a lie so smooth she'd clearly practiced it. "He wants to make it right. Come to a real family dinner. Just us. 2 days from now." I knew what just us meant. It meant Gerald Voss again. It meant an audience for another performance. My father didn't want to apologize. He wanted a rematch. "I don't think that's a good idea," I said. "Please, Cora," my mother said. And there it was, the old hook. "You've already broken this family once. Don't do it again over a joke." I was about to say no. Daniel, folding laundry beside me, heard the whole thing. He caught my eye and shook his head, slow. Then he mouthed something to me, silent. "Go." I covered the phone. "Why?" I whispered. He set down the shirt he was holding. "Because he asked what a teacher does," Daniel said, calm as still water. "Let's go answer him. Give me 2 days." I searched his face for what he was planning. He gave me nothing but that quiet, patient look. So I uncovered the phone and told my mother we'd come. When I hung up, I turned to my husband. 2 days for what?" He only smiled and picked the shirt back up. "Trust me," he said. And God help me, I did. But I wasn't going to sit still for 2 days while he did whatever he had in mind. My father had thrown down a challenge without knowing it. He asked what a teacher was worth. I intended to make sure the whole town answered. I started that same night, in the hospital break room. Dr. Sarah Whitfield is one of our ER physicians. She's brilliant, 36, grew up 2 towns over. We were charting side by side when she asked how my weekend went. I told her the truth, more of it than I meant to. When I got to the part about my husband, she stopped writing. "Wait," she said. "Daniel Bradford? History teacher, tall, dry sense of humor?" I stared at her. "You know him?" "Cora, that man is the reason I'm a doctor." She put down her pen. "I was going to drop out at 16. My mom was sick. I was working nights. Mr. Bradford sat me down and told me I was too smart to quit, and then he made sure I didn't." She shook her head. "I sent him my white coat photo the day I matched. Do you know he wrote back a whole page?" I felt something click into place in my chest. I asked her carefully, "If I told you my father called Daniel a babysitter who works for pennies, what would you say?" Sarah's face went flat and hard. "I'd say your father should meet the people that babysitter raised." "Would you come say it to his face?" I asked. 2 days from now, at dinner." She didn't even blink. "Text me the address." I walked out to my car with my heart pounding, and I made a list on the back of a receipt. Sarah was one. There had to be more. If my father wanted to talk about worth, I would bring him worth he could see with his own eyes, sitting in his own dining room, wearing the faces of the children he'd never bothered to notice. Before I left the parking lot, Sarah knocked on my window. She had one more thing to say. "You know about the scholarship fund, right?" she asked. "The anonymous one?" I told her everyone knew about it. Nobody knew who ran it. "That's the thing," she said, leaning in. "Nobody knows. 10 years of it. Some person in this town has quietly paid tuition for I don't know how many kids. No name, no credit. Every year another envelope, another kid saved." She paused. "I always figured it was somebody rich, a doctor, a lawyer, somebody with real money." I drove home slower than I needed to, because something was turning over in my mind and I didn't like how it fit. 10 years. For as long as I'd known him, he'd been strangely careful with money. We had enough, but never quite as much as 2 salaries should leave. He drove a truck with 200,000 miles on it. He never wanted anything for himself. Once, early on, I'd found a stack of blank envelopes in his desk and a bank slip I didn't understand, and he'd just said, "Bills," and kissed my forehead, and I'd let it go. I let a lot of things go with Daniel because he never once gave me a reason to worry. Now I sat in my driveway with the engine ticking, and I did the math, and I couldn't quite make myself believe it. It was too big. It was too quiet. It was too exactly like him. I didn't have proof. Not yet. But I knew where he kept the things that mattered. And the next afternoon, looking for a warm sweater in the back of our closet, I would find the answer. In a battered cardboard box he'd never once mentioned. The box was on the top shelf, behind our winter blankets, soft at the corners from age. I only pulled it down because I thought it held old scarves. Instead, when I lifted the lid, I found letters. Hundreds of them. Some typed, most in the wobbly handwriting of teenagers, some yellowed and 15 years old. I sat down on the closet floor and started to read, and I couldn't stop. "You are the only adult who ever believed me. I didn't kill myself junior year because of you. I never told you that. I'm telling you now. I'm the first person in my family to go to college. That's yours as much as mine. Thank you for driving me. Thank you for the coat. Thank you for pretending you didn't notice I hadn't eaten." I was crying before I reached the bottom of the first handful, and then, under the letters, I found the other thing. A thick folder of bank records. Transfers, one after another, going back 10 years. Each one made out to the Cedar Hollow Scholarship Fund. Each one signed in Daniel's steady hand under a single typed word. Anonymous. My husband was the town's secret angel. The man my father called pennies had quietly given away more of himself than my father had earned in trophies. He'd done it for a decade, without a single person's applause, while grading papers past midnight and driving a truck held together by faith. I sat on that closet floor and understood, finally, why he'd stayed so calm at that table. He didn't need my father to know what he was worth. He already knew. And he'd decided that mattered more than being right. I put every letter back exactly as I'd found it. I closed the box, but I did not put it back on the shelf, because in 2 days my father was going to ask again what a teacher does, and I had just found the answer, in a cardboard box my husband thought no one would ever open. If you've ever watched someone you love get judged for what they earn instead of who they are, then you already know why my hands were shaking on that closet floor. Stay with me, because what my husband did at that second dinner changed everything for my family, and it isn't at all what I expected. And if this story is hitting home for you right now, take 1 second to subscribe so it can find someone else who needs to hear it tonight. That evening, I asked him about the box. I didn't accuse. I just said, quietly, "Daniel, I found the letters and the bank records." He was at the sink, and his hands went still in the water. He didn't turn around right away. When he did, he wasn't angry. He looked almost shy, which I'd never seen on him. "You weren't supposed to find those," he said. "Why?" I asked. Why keep it a secret? From me? From everyone? He dried his hands slowly. Because giving isn't giving if you send a bill, he said. The second people know, it stops being for them and starts being for you. He sat down across from me. My dad was a carpenter. He built half the pews in the church and never once put his name on anything. He used to say, "The work is the signature." Daniel shrugged. Somebody helped me when I was a broke kid who wanted to teach. I promised I'd pass it on quiet. So I did. I reached across the table and held his hand. You let my father humiliate you, I said, and you could have leveled him with one sentence. I could have, he agreed, but I don't own those kids' stories. They're not mine to spend to win an argument. I understood him then, completely, and I loved him more than I ever had. But I also made a decision, right there, and I didn't tell him. He was right that he shouldn't brag. He was right that the letters weren't his to wave around, but the town story wasn't only his to keep quiet either. Those kids were grown now, and if they wanted to answer my father, that was their choice to make. Not mine, and not Daniel's. I just had to give them the door. I had 2 days. I used them. While Daniel taught his classes, I drove all over Cedar Hollow, and I did the one thing my father would never do. I asked people about a teacher. Sheriff Tom Buckley met me at the station. He's a big, quiet man of 40, and when I told him what my father had said, his jaw worked for a second. Mr. Bradford sat with me every single day the year my dad walked out, he said. I'd have gone bad without him. Ask anybody. He put on his hat. What time's dinner? Carl Denton owns the biggest lumber yard in the county now. 15 years ago, he was a kid with a temper and no prospects. Mr. B wrote the letter that got me my first business loan, Carl told me. Bank turned me down twice. His letter turned it around. I've hired 40 people since. He shook my hand hard. We'll be there. I found Megan Holloway between meetings. She's 29 and just won a seat in the state legislature. My mother cleaned houses, she told me. Mr. Bradford paid for the test prep she couldn't. Never asked for a thing. Her eyes shone. Tell me where to be. I didn't have to push a single one of them. That's what stayed with me. I just said the words my father used, babysitter for pennies, and watched each of them go quiet, then hard, then certain. By the second evening, I had lost count of who was coming. The list on my receipt had spilled onto 3 more. I drove home in the dark with my throat tight, both terrified and sure. My father wanted a dinner. He was going to get one he'd remember for the rest of his life. That night, my mother called again, to confirm. What she really wanted was to soften me up. Wear something nice, she said, and please, Cora, don't make a scene. Your father only ever wanted the best for you. You were always so dramatic. There it was, the word she'd used my whole life to describe the moments I told the truth. Dramatic. But then she surprised me. Her voice dropped, just for a second. You know I wanted to be a teacher once, she said. Before I married your father, a kindergarten teacher. Then she caught herself, and the pearls went back on. But that's no life. Your father was right about that. And she hung up before I could answer. I sat with the phone in my lap and felt, for one strange moment, sorry for her. She'd buried a whole self to keep the peace, and she'd been telling herself it was wisdom ever since. But sympathy is not the same as surrender. I remembered every time she'd watched my father cut me down and said nothing. Later, I told Daniel I was scared. What if I'm just becoming him? I said. Ambushing people at dinner, making a scene. Maybe he's right. Maybe I'm the dramatic one. Daniel took my face in both hands. You're not exposing me, he said. You're not making a scene. You're opening a door. Every person who walks through it is walking on their own. That's not drama, Cora. That's just what happens when a town finally gets to speak. I held on to that. I had to. Because in less than a day, I was going to walk back into the room where my father broke me at 28, and this time I would not be walking in alone. The morning of the dinner, my grandmother asked me to come by early. She was in her garden, wrapped in that ancient coat, pruning roses that didn't need it. "Sit," she said. So I sat. "I told you there were things you didn't know." Margaret set down her shears. "I know what your Daniel does, Cora. The quiet giving. I've known for 2 years." I stared at her. "How?" "I ran into him at the bank," she said, smiling. "He was mailing one of his envelopes. He turned red as a beet and begged me not to tell. So I didn't." She reached over and patted my hand. "But I've been waiting a long time to see my son learn something he can't buy." Her eyes were wet and fierce at the same time. "Your father is not a bad man, Cora. He's a frightened one. He grew up with nothing and decided money was the only thing that couldn't leave him. He looks at your husband and he doesn't see a teacher. He sees a man who isn't afraid of being poor. And that terrifies him." She squeezed my hand. "You know what you've arranged for tonight? I can see it on you." I started to explain, to justify, but she shook her head. "Let them come, sweetheart," she said. "Your father needs to hear the town. He won't hear it from you. He won't hear it from Daniel. But he might hear it from 40 of his neighbors standing in his own dining room." She picked her shears back up. "I'll be there, in the good chair, where I can watch his face." I drove home with my grandmother's blessing sitting warm in my chest, and for the first time in 5 years I felt like a member of my family instead of its casualty. Daniel had his own preparations. That afternoon I watched him take the cardboard box down from where I'd left it and set it on the kitchen table. He opened it and began, carefully, to choose. Not all the letters, just a few. He handled them like they were made of glass. Then he reached to the very bottom and pulled out something flat, wrapped in a plastic sleeve. It was a certificate. State Teacher of the Year. His name in gold. A date from 6 years back. I'd never seen it in my life. "You won that," I said. "And you never hung it up?" He looked almost embarrassed. "Felt like bragging," he said. He slid it into the box with the letters. "What are you bringing it for?" I asked. He closed the lid gently. "Your father asked what a teacher does," Daniel said. It was a fair question. Rude, but fair. I'm just going to answer it honestly. He looked at me, steady. Not to brag. Not to win. He wanted to know what 15 years of my life adds up to. So I'll show him. He tucked the box under his arm. "I've never done this before," he admitted. "Shown anyone. But he asked in front of your whole family. So I'll answer the same way." I didn't tell him about the 40 people driving toward that house at that very moment. I wanted him to walk in as himself, carrying only his box and his quiet. The rest would arrive on its own. I just kissed him and said, "Whatever happens tonight, I already know exactly what you're worth." He smiled. "So do about 300 kids," he said. Then he caught himself, went red, and I laughed for the first time in 2 days. An hour before we left, my father called me himself, which he almost never did. "Cora," he said, brisk, like a foreman. "Glad you're being reasonable. Now listen. Tell your teacher to dress properly tonight. Gerald's coming, and his boy Brett. Successful young man now. Runs the whole firm." He let that sit. "I'm just saying, it wouldn't hurt for you to see what your options were, in case you ever get tired of pennies." I gripped the phone so hard my knuckles hurt. 5 years. 5 years of silence. And here he was, still trying to trade me like lumber, still dangling Brett Voss like I was a girl who'd made a bad purchase. He hadn't learned one single thing. "Anything else, Dad?" I said, very evenly. "Just don't embarrass us," he said. "This family has a reputation in this town." I almost laughed out loud. A reputation. He had no idea what this town actually thought, or of whom. "Don't worry, Dad," I said. "By the end of the night, everyone will know exactly what this family is." He took that as agreement. "Good girl," he said, and hung up. I stood in my kitchen and let the last of my hesitation drain away. I'd spent 2 days half afraid I was being cruel. That phone call cured me. My father wasn't a wounded man who'd said one thoughtless thing. He was a man who, given 5 years and a second chance, chose to insult my marriage and shop me around to his business partner's son in the same breath. Whatever happened at that table tonight, he had earned every second of it. I picked up my coat. I called to Daniel that it was time, and we drove east, toward the house where all of this began. Here's what almost stopped me. In the car, my phone kept buzzing, and not all of it was good news. Sarah texted that she might get called in for a trauma. Sheriff Buckley wasn't sure he could get off shift. 2 of the others sent apologies. Megan Holloway had a late vote at the Capitol. One by one, the certain things turned into maybes, and I felt the whole plan wobbling under me. What if I'd built this up in my head, and only 3 people came? What if my father sat there smug at the head of his table while a handful of stragglers mumbled something and left? What if I turned my husband's dignity into a joke that flopped? I pulled over on the shoulder of Route 9, hazard lights ticking, and told Daniel the truth. I did something, I said. I invited people, your kids, grown up now, to come tonight and tell him who you are, and now half of them can't make it, and I think I've ruined everything. I braced for him to be angry or hurt that I'd gone behind his quiet. He wasn't. He reached over and put the car back in drive for me, his hand over mine on the gear shift. Cora, he said, even if not one person comes, we walk into that house with our heads up. We eat dinner, we're polite, and then we go home to our own life, which is a good one. He smiled. The people are a gift, but they're not the point. You are. I wiped my face and pulled back onto the road. Whatever waited at that table, 3 people or 30, I was going to walk in beside the best man I knew, and that was already a kind of winning my father would never understand. The dining room was set like a magazine. Sharon had used the good china, the tall candles, the flowers she buys when she wants to win. Gerald Voss was already there, and Brett beside him, older now, in a suit that cost more than our mortgage payment. My father sat at the head of the table beneath his wall of awards, exactly where he always sits, like a man on a throne he built himself. My grandmother was in the good chair, small and calm, hands folded, watching. Daniel set his cardboard box down by the sideboard, quietly, out of the way. My father saw it and smirked. "Bring your lunch?" he said. A few people chuckled. Daniel just smiled and pulled out my chair for me. We sat. For a few minutes it was almost a normal dinner. My mother passed the rolls and narrated the menu. Gerald talked about the market. Brett tried to catch my eye twice, and I looked right through him. My father held court, telling a story about a job he'd won, the number at the center of it like always. And the whole time, under the table, my leg would not stop bouncing, because I was listening past him, listening toward the front of the house, waiting. I want you to picture that long table. My father at the head of it, so sure he'd already won. His wall of trophies behind him, his business partner beside him, his silent wife pouring the wine. He thought this was his night. He thought he was about to remind his ungrateful daughter what real success looked like. He had no idea. Because just as he lifted his glass to make a toast, the doorbell rang. I want you to hold that image with me. That long table, my father at the head of it, glass raised, certain he'd already won. Keep watching, because that doorbell was only the first. If you are rooting for my husband right now, do me a favor and let me know in the comments. It genuinely means more than you think. And now, let me tell you who was standing on my father's porch. My mother frowned. "Are we expecting someone?" she asked. My father waved his hand. "Probably a delivery. Sit." But it wasn't a delivery. My mother opened the door and Dr. Sarah Whitfield stepped in, still in her hospital badge, holding a pie like she'd been raised right. "I'm so sorry to intrude," she said warmly. "I'm a friend of the family. I heard there was a dinner." She crossed the room straight to my husband. "Mr. Bradford," she said, and her voice caught. "I don't know if you remember me, Sarah. You told me I was too smart to drop out." Daniel stood, and his face changed for the first time all night. "Sarah Whitfield," he said softly. "Of course I remember you. You're a doctor now." I'm an ER physician, she said, turning to face my father directly. Because of him. My mother was dying and I was ready to quit at 16. This man drove to my house and would not let me. My father blinked, thrown. That's very nice, but we're in the middle of... The doorbell rang again. This time it was Sheriff Tom Buckley, in uniform, hat in his hands. He nodded to the room, then walked to Daniel and gripped his hand. Mr. Bradford. He turned to my father, calm and enormous. You don't know me, sir. But this man sat with me every day the year my father left. I carry a badge instead of a grudge because of him. My father's smile was starting to slip. He looked at me, then at the door, and something uneasy moved behind his eyes. Cora, he said slowly. What is this? And before I could answer, the doorbell rang a third time, then a fourth. Then it simply didn't stop. They came in a river. Carl Denton, the lumber baron, in his good flannel, filling the doorway. Behind him, Megan Holloway, who'd left her vote to drive 2 hours. Wanda from the diner, still in her apron, holding her son Cody by the sleeve. A young man who'd become a nurse. A woman who taught kindergarten now because Daniel once told her she'd be good at it. A firefighter, a mechanic, a pastor. A pair of twins who ran the hardware store. On and on, more than I had dared to hope for. Filling the hall, spilling into the dining room, pressing shoulder to shoulder against my father's wall of awards until you could barely see the frames. They were quiet. That was the thing. Nobody shouted. Nobody was cruel. They just came, and they stood. And they looked at Daniel with a kind of love my father had never once earned in that room. Sharon had a hand pressed to her mouth. Gerald Voss and his son had gone very still, forgotten in their expensive suits. My grandmother sat in the good chair with tears running down her face and the smallest smile I have ever seen, watching her son's world rearrange itself in front of him. And my father stood up. He looked around at 40 of his neighbors standing silent in his dining room, people he passed at the gas station and the bank and the country club, and I watched him fail to understand it. His face went red, then a mottled purple. What in God's name is this? He demanded. Who let all these people into my house? Nobody answered him. They weren't there for him. I stood up from my chair, and every eye in that room turned to me, and my father's loudest, angriest attention landed square on his daughter. Cora, he said, low and dangerous, you explain this, right now. I was not shaking anymore. 5 years of silence and a whole town at my back, and the calmest man in the world sitting beside me. I had never in my life felt steadier. Sit down, Dad, I said quietly. Some people came to answer your question. My father did not sit down. He gripped the back of his chair and stared at me. So I kept my voice low and even, the way you talk to a frightened patient. 2 days ago, at Grandma's birthday, you asked my husband what a teacher does, I said. You called him a babysitter. You said he works for pennies. You said it in front of everyone, and then you laughed. The room was so quiet I could hear the candles. So these are some of his students. They drove here tonight on their own because they wanted to answer you. I turned to them. You don't have to, but if anyone wants to tell my father what Daniel Bradford does, the floor is yours. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Megan Holloway stepped forward, still in her legislative pin. Mr. Aldrich, she said, I'm a state representative. My mother cleaned houses for a living. When I couldn't afford the college test prep, Mr. Bradford paid for it and told me never to mention it. I write laws now. That's what a teacher does. She stepped back. Sheriff Buckley spoke next, plain and heavy. He kept me out of trouble every day for a year. I'd be in a cell instead of a cruiser. Carl Denton cleared his throat. His letter got me the loan the banks wouldn't. I employ 40 of your neighbors, Mr. Aldrich. That's what a teacher does. One by one they spoke, and each one ended it the same way, like a hymn with a chorus. That's what a teacher does. My father's mouth opened and closed. He looked at the faces filling his own dining room, and for the first time in my life I watched Raymond Aldrich have absolutely nothing to say. Then, because he is who he is, He found his footing in the only way he knew. He slammed his palm on the table so the china jumped. "This is a setup!" he shouted, his voice cracking. "This is an ambush in my own house. Did she pay you people to come here and humiliate me?" Nobody flinched at his shouting. That was what undid him. He was used to a raised voice clearing a room, and instead the room just looked at him, patient, unmoved. Carl Denton was the one who spoke into that silence. "Nobody paid us, Mr. Aldrich," he said quietly. "We came because of what he did, and because of something you don't know." He glanced at Daniel, who had gone pale, already shaking his head, already saying, "Carl, don't." But Carl kept going, gentle and certain. "You've got a certificate on that wall, sir. Your donation to the Cedar Hollow Scholarship Fund. You've bragged on it at the club for years." My father's chest was still heaving. "What of it?" "The fund's got an anonymous donor," Carl said. 10 years now. Paid tuition for I've lost count of how many local kids. Whole town's wondered who it is." He nodded toward my husband. "A few of us found out last year by accident. He begged us not to tell a soul." "So we never did." Carl's voice thickened. "It's him, Mr. Aldrich. It's been Daniel the whole time. The teacher you called Pennies has quietly put more kids through school than anyone in this county." The room made a sound, a soft collective intake of breath, as 40 people who'd suspected it heard it confirmed at last. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. Her eyes went to Daniel's cardboard box by the sideboard, and then, strangely, to nothing at all. And I remembered a kindergarten teacher she'd wanted to be 60 years ago, and I watched something old and grieving cross her face before she pushed it back down. And my father, the man who had once framed a single donation and let a whole town wonder if he was the secret angel, stood there and finally understood that the angel had been sitting at his table all along. He had insulted him. He had called him worthless. He had offered his own daughter to another man right in front of him. My father's face drained from purple to gray, and his mouth worked, and no words came out at all. I watched my father try to climb back on top of it, the only way he knew how. He grabbed for the one thing that had never failed him: contempt. "So he gives away a teacher's salary," he said, forcing a laugh that had nothing under it. "A few dollars here and there to feel important. It's still pennies. Charity is what people do when they can't build anything real." And that was when Daniel finally stood up. He crossed to the sideboard, unhurried, and picked up the cardboard box and set it in the middle of my mother's beautiful table, right on top of the flowers. He opened it. He took out the letters, handful after handful, and laid them across the china. 15 years of them. He set the state certificate down beside them, his name in gold catching the candlelight. And then he pulled out the folder of bank records, 10 years of transfers, and laid it open in front of my father so he could read the total at the bottom with his own eyes. My father looked down at a number larger than the donation he'd bragged about for a decade. Daniel didn't raise his voice. He never once raised his voice. "You asked what 15 years of my life adds up to," he said, quiet as a closing door. He tapped the folder gently. "You called it pennies." He looked my father dead in the eye. The pennies added up. The room was absolutely silent. My father stared at the letters, at the total, at the certificate with the gold seal, and his hands were trembling now, and he had no number bigger than this to throw back. For the first time in his entire life, Raymond Aldrich had been out-earned in the only currency that had ever actually mattered, by a man he'd tried to shrink into nothing, and he knew it, and everyone in that room watching him knew it too. And Daniel, having answered the question honestly, as promised, simply stood there, calm, done, waiting for nothing. My father turned on me. Of course he did. When a man like that can't win, he looks for someone to blame, and I have always been the safest target in his house. "You did this," he said, his voice shaking with fury, and something underneath it that might have been fear. "You brought these people into my home to humiliate your own father. After everything I gave you, this is how you repay me. You've always been dramatic, Cora. But this Stop. I didn't shout it. I said it the way I say things at 3 in the morning to families in the worst moment of their lives, quiet and final. He stopped. I didn't do this to humiliate you, I said. I invited them, but not one of them came for you. They came for him. Every single person in this room drove here on their own, because of who my husband is. I stood, and I walked around the table until I was standing beside Daniel, and I faced my father across the wreck of his perfect dinner. You spent your whole life counting money, Dad, I said. He spent his counting kids. I let that sit. I came back for Grandma, and I came back so you could see, one time, exactly who I chose. Not so you'd approve. I stopped needing that a long time ago. 5 years ago. At this very table, actually. My father's jaw was working. You don't have to respect him, I went on, steady. You're clearly not capable of it. But you will never mock my husband in front of me again. And you will never again offer me to Gerald's son like I'm a piece of property. Those days are over. If you can't manage that, you won't see me. It's that simple. I had waited my entire life to say those words. And I said them without heat, without tears, without 1 ounce of the drama he'd always accused me of. I just said them plainly and true. And then I stopped, and I let the silence belong to him. My father did not apologize. I want to be honest about that because I know how the story is supposed to go. He didn't crumble and beg forgiveness. That isn't who he is. Instead, he looked around at the 40 people watching him lose, and his fear turned back into anger, because anger was the only room in the house he knew how to live in. Get out, he said. His voice was low and ugly. All of you. This is a circus. Get out of my house. Nobody argued. They didn't need to. They had already said everything they came to say. One by one they filed past him, and as they went, each of them touched Daniel. On the shoulder, on the arm, a hand, a nod, the whole town saying goodnight to the man my father had called worthless. My mother stood frozen by the sideboard, tears on her face, and when she finally moved, she moved to my father's side and took his arm and stayed there. Her one small moment of remembering who she might have been was already gone, folded back into 60 years of keeping the peace. My grandmother rose last from the good chair, slow and deliberate. She walked over to Daniel and reached up and put her small hand on his cheek. Now they know, she said. Then she turned to her son, and she didn't yell, and she didn't cry. She just looked at Raymond for a long moment, with a sadness older than all of us, and she said, Your father built pews and never signed one. I always hoped some of him made it into you. And she walked out on my arm, past the wall of awards, into the cool night, leaving my father alone at the head of his long table, surrounded by the ruins of the only kind of proof he'd ever believed in. We didn't stay in Cedar Hollow much longer that night. There was no dramatic reconciliation, and I didn't want a fake one. Daniel packed his letters back into their box, careful as always, and we drove home to our leaning porch and our warm kitchen. In the weeks after, a few things changed, and a lot of things didn't. My father never called to apologize, but my grandmother told me, a month later, that he'd asked her, gruff and cornered, whether the town really thought that much of him. Of Daniel. She said yes. She said Raymond went quiet for a long time after that. It wasn't an apology. It was the closest a man like him gets to one, and I decided that was his business, not mine. I kept seeing my grandmother. I brought her soup and sat in her garden and let her tell me the old stories. I did not go back to my father's table, and he did not ask me to, and for the first time that absence felt like peace instead of a wound. Daniel kept teaching. He kept driving that terrible truck. Somewhere in the county, envelopes kept arriving at the scholarship fund with no name on them, because the town had kept his secret even after they'd spilled it, out of respect for the man who never wanted the credit. Nothing about how Cedar Hollow saw my husband change that night. They'd always known. The only person who'd needed to learn it was my father, and whether he ever truly did was up to him now. As for me, I stopped waiting. And a few months later, Daniel and I decided we were ready to raise a kid of our own. in a house where a person's worth would never once be measured in dollars. I used to think respect was something you begged from the people who raised you, and that if you were just good enough, quiet enough, patient enough, they would finally hand it over. But it isn't a thing anyone hands you at all. It's what a whole town gives a quiet man who never once asked for it, and it's what you finally give yourself the day you stop asking the one person who was never going to say it. That's my story. 5 years of silence, one cruel sentence at a dinner table, and a whole town that answered when my father wouldn't. If there's someone in your life who measures people by their paycheck instead of their heart, take this as your sign to stop asking them for permission to be proud of who you love. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.